Hello, I'm Yonit Levy of Channel 12 in Tel Aviv.
And I'm Jonathan Friedland of The Guardian in London.
And we are Unholy, two Jews on the news from Keshe Podcasts. Hi, Jonathan.
Hello, Yonit. It's a festive season, my calendar tells me.
It is not a festive mood, though, is it? But it is
funny.
Purim. Not the best of times to celebrate Purim. Hasn't been for 2 years, but definitely not this year.
Well, this is what's funny about it, because for 2 years, there was a reason why I could tell you, look, Purim is not really happening. Although, as I've said before, it definitely carried on happening among my Haredi neighbours around here in N16, London. But this time I thought, okay, this will be the first Purim that's like a real Purim, because everyone will emerge from COVID and it'll be back to something like normal. And of course, because of Ukraine, it's just not kind of the mood, I feel. I mean, I don't know. It would be interesting if maybe I should ask this question of some of my neighbours, but I'm not sure, it's dampened their mood much. But it may, maybe, because obviously there are, big connections between the Haredi world and Ukraine. So maybe, I don't know. What about in Israel, where obviously Purim is a much bigger deal in every way?
Purim is like a huge deal here. Obviously, like the office Purim parties are like the equivalent of the Christmas party where you are. And obviously for 2 years, not really a big deal. But this year, as always, Purim is this, and I talked about this last year, extended into these 8 days of costumes, right? You have kids, You have the official costume day, and then you have all kinds of extensions to that, like the Prince's Day, and the Hat Day, and the Animal Day, and the Drive Your Parents Insane Day, et cetera, and obviously never coordinated. So you always have to remember, I have this list of what kid does what theme. But I do have
on what day? Is this the 8 days leading to Purim, or is it 8 days after?
The 4 days before and 4 days after, basically, right?
My word.
So
for a parent, this is horrendous.
It's a big deal. And I was thinking about this because it really is this year. No one's in a good mood, right? I mean, there's a war in Europe. No one is in a good mood. There were like gray days here. Everything was sort of depressing weather and a depressing mood. And then there was this moment that I kind of wanted to share with you. I was walking with my daughter, who's 3.5, and we were walking with her kindergarten in a little sort of Purim procession through the neighborhood. And you see these little kids holding hands with their costumes, the small dinosaur and the little policeman and the little girl dressed as Elsa. I wonder whose kid she was, and from Frozen and, all that kind of. And then suddenly this mood changes in the neighborhood. It's as if someone was holding like fairy dust, and these little kids, and everyone is looking at them and they're smiling. And you get that moment of Purim, of being somewhere else and being someone else for a moment with your little, ill-fitted polyester made costume. But you can be in that happy moment and your happy bubble for just a minute. If anyone, I think, needs to understand or needs to know how to have experience in celebrating when the world around them is burning, it's us. No, I mean, it's okay to, for a minute. I love that.
I think it's a very lovely thought. And it just underlines a tiny bit that contrast between where you are and where I am. Because of course, Purim is a national event where you are, to the point where there's a procession in the street. And I can, by the way, imagine how lovely that would be. Enchanting to see little children in procession like that. Here, mainly, it's obviously nationally a complete non-event. No one knows what it is. In my little neighborhood, of course, it is a little event. My first contact point, my first touch point with Purim this year was a late night walk with Freddie, our puppy, who I think listeners may be aware of Freddie. But Freddie and I were going for our little walk, and he encountered for the first time absolutely pounding kind of rave music coming on the back of a flatbed truck, which was driving around the neighborhood loaded with these giant, head-high speakers, pounding out really kind of quite hardcore dance music, sounded to me, which was from our ultra-Orthodox friends who are getting into party mode. And Freddie was absolutely freaked out by it. He was completely, up, because this is the only day in the year when that kind of music intrudes into this neighborhood. And who knew that, these otherwise very
demure and quiet,
head down, sort of demure, pious folk and neighbors can really can get it on when Purim comes around. So Freddie was a little bit freaked out, but yes, it was a little brush with Purim. I'm not saying it had quite the charm and sparkle that you've described, but yeah, this is one part of the world. In a way, it's all part of continuing and carrying on, and life, has to keep going. So Purim is a reminder of that, perhaps.
Yes, a little bit. But the rest of the world is still crazy. And, I think of this book that I love that you probably haven't read just because you don't like fantasy or that kind of style. But the great Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman wrote a book together once, two Englishmen, who wrote a book called Good Omens. And there was this fallen angel who wrote back to hell, like, guys, whatever you're doing tormenting human beings, forget it, because whatever they do to themselves is always worse. And I kind of think of that these days. It really is. Maybe it's the fact that we're being impatient and we're kind of asking ourselves, okay, when does this end? And how does this end? And how, we talked about this a lot with Anne Applebaum last week, like the choice between two pretty horrible decisions. One is maybe risking an all-out war with Russia and a nuclear war. And the other one is what? Letting him get away with it? Like, how do we end this?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. There is this terrible sort of Hobson's choice at the moment between, allowing him to keep bombing and terrorizing the people of Ukraine, and on the other hand, risking a nuclear confrontation. Neither option is at all appealing. And you saw it with that moment this week when Volodymyr Zelensky addressed Congress via video link. And, the audience, of course, leapt to their feet and standing ovation, but they're very divided. Some of them think you've got to do more, and others think we can keep applauding, but we can't act, because if we do, we risk nuclear apocalypse, and they can't face that. But I think you're right about ending also raises a kind of hideous moral predicament, because of course, on one level, and I'm following, I think as we all are, we're following hour by hour the news and hoping there is some word from these talks, which have surprised people, I think, by being apparently serious. I don't think they're just or not entirely for show. There's obviously part of it that's for show. And on one part of you is thinking, yes, let there be a truce. And then another part of me, and this is a very, in a way, unexpected thought, thinks, well, actually, if there was a truce which froze everything in place and said, Putin's still there, he still gets to keep Crimea and those regions in the Donbass, is that a terrible kind of compromise, which means he lives to fight another day and lives to invade another day, either has another go at getting the rest of Ukraine, this time gets his act together, reforms the military and then makes it, fighting fit, or even goes for somewhere else, Moldova or the Baltics or whatever. There is that idea which haunts me a bit, that line, I think I put it to Anne Applebaum, comes from the chess grandmaster Garry Kasparov, dictators like this only stop when they're stopped. And if Putin is allowed to anything other than total defeat, well, then that worries me, because then Putinism is still a force in the world. And, our lesson from the Second World War, and everybody is constantly invoking lessons from that. But in the end, it did require Germany's total and utter defeat before you could begin to Nazism's total and utter defeat, maybe is a better way of putting it, before you could, move on. Yeah.
And again, it does beg the question, does it need to look like a defeat? Is it a defeat without appearing to be a defeat? How do you walk him down off a ledge of a very bad idea, right? I mean, firstly, let's stop this and then see what happens. You mentioned the deal that everyone is talking about. We haven't seen, obviously, to this moment, what we're really discussing. We assume that it is something like Russia backs down and Ukraine renounces its ambitions, its NATO ambitions. What I have to point out, of course, is that, at least according to the Financial Times report, right, Naftali Bennett is being the mediator, is the person in the middle of this, and they say that he's a primary international mediator. I don't know if this is true, but it is really interesting, Jonathan, because we've been talking so many weeks here about this sort of what is becoming morally untenable position Israel is trying to hold, right, as being, on the one hand, right, we're stuck between the United States and our alliance with them, and the fact that Russia is here on our border in Syria, and we have to balance long-term security strategically and against an immediate diplomatic benefit. But what I would do, like my instinct would be, okay, if this is the situation, I just hide under the table and wait for this to be over. Naftali Bennett is doing the exact opposite. He is putting himself in the center of this, and it's either a huge success, which don't know what the odds of that is, right? That the whole world is giving him a standing ovation and saying, you succeeded in this. Both sides are very pleased. Or on the other hand, a total failure, an abject failure. And then what happens? He gambled, this huge gamble.
It seems to me a really interesting example of if life gives you lemons, make lemonade, which is Naftali Bennett's situation is that he has to maintain some kind of neutrality or stay on the fence for all the reasons you've explained so well, that Israel has this peculiar need not to provoke Russia too much, given that Russia's there in the backyard in Syria, but obviously the strategic relationship with America. So those are the lemons. And make lemonade, which is, okay, if I have to be on the fence, let me pose as if that's a deliberate choice in order to remain a credible mediator. So if I have to be on the fence, let me be the umpire. That's quite an interesting bit of, in a way, quite creative. I mean, he's saying, here's my situation, let's make a virtue out of it. And who knows if something good will come out of it.
So we have been talking about Israel's stance. It does seem that the United States is, in any case, losing its patience, right? And Israel isn't officially joining the sanctions, although you do hear Yair Lapid, the foreign minister here, saying this week, Israel will not be a route to bypass sanctions. So let's hear, before everything else, we want to talk about sanctions and oligarchs, very relevant to where you are and to where I am. But let's hear Victoria Nuland. She's the Undersecretary of State, the U.S. Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, what she had to say to our correspondent, our U.S. correspondent, Una Leibson. And this is pretty harsh in diplomatic jargon. Let's listen to that.
We have to squeeze the regime. We have to deny it the income that it needs, squeeze the oligarchs around him. We squeeze its economy. So in that context, we're asking as many countries as we can to join us. We're asking that of Israel as well. Among other things, you don't want to become the last haven for dirty money that's fueling Putin's wars.
So that's quite something, that warning from the Biden administration, which is the right moment to introduce our guest this week. Oliver Bullough is the author of not one but two celebrated books on the former Soviet Union, The Last Man in Russia and Let Our Fame Be Great. But really importantly for our purposes, his new book is called Butler to the World. It focuses on how Britain became the servant of tycoons, tax dodgers, kleptocrats and criminals in Oliver Bullough's subtitle. But Oliver, we wanted to dip into your expertise about the extent to which Israel is playing a kind of similar role in a way, and several of these oligarchs that are in the crosshairs of these sanctions are either permanently in Israel or are now in Israel. Famously Roman Abramovich, owner of Chelsea Football Club, who we've talked about on this podcast before. But just tell us what the sort of scale of the phenomenon is. How many, what kind, who are they, the oligarchs who are in Israel?
Well, I mean, as is well known, obviously, a lot of the Soviet Jewish population chose to leave, to go either to Israel or the United States or elsewhere. In fact, there's a rather celebrated Soviet joke about Andropov, the head of the KGB, reporting to Leonid Brezhnev that he had bad news, that all 8 million of the Soviet Union's 4 million Jews wanted to leave to go to Israel. It's not difficult to imagine why people wanted to leave. And because of the anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union, many, talented, motivated, ambitious Soviets of Jewish ethnicity were excluded from senior positions in the party and the government and so on. So when opportunities opened up in the 1980s in the new cooperatives and then in the private sector, often Jewish people were among the first people to take them up, having been frustrated by their desire to advance in other ways. So there was a disproportionate number of ethnic Jews among the early group of oligarchs, among whom, of course, Roman Abramovich is one of the most well-known, but not the only one. I mean, we can look at other famous oligarchs like Mikhail Hodorkovsky or so on, who, and often, after it became possible, they forged links with Israel, which, for natural reasons, became a haven for them. Now, I can understand why the United States government is currently scolding Israel for providing, as it were, a loophole in this increasingly global sanctions regime. But it does seem a little bit short-sighted, because Israel has played a role as a haven, both for good and bad, for wealthy and non-wealthy Jews, originally from the Soviet Union, ever since 1991, in fact, going back even further.
The interesting thing, you're talking about Israel becoming a haven. Obviously, the law of return that allows for some of them to become Israel citizens is not what this was intended for originally. But there's also a law in Israel called the Arnon-Milchan law, or dubbed the Arnon-Milchan law, that gives these very rich people the tax exemption for them to come and live in Israel, and also that they don't have to report back, which also gives that kind of a loophole. And I think Israel is also a haven because it's a small country. And if you want to make a big splash, and sometimes these oligarchs do, then you can spend a relative small amount and you could buy a newspaper or buy a television channel and you have a huge effect. That also probably speaks to them.
Yeah, but I mean, I think at the moment we're all remembering that oligarchs are bad. But there are times certainly in the last 20 years, in the time of 22 years since Putin took over, when, we weren't feeling quite so negatively towards oligarchs. Look back in the very early days of Putin's reign, in fact, slightly before him, Vladimir Gusinsky, for example, a media magnate who, let's face it, not pure as the driven snow, because anyone who became wealthy in the 1990s was not. But his television channel, NTV, played a crucial role as an independent source of information for Russian citizens looking to find information, for example, about the war in Chechnya. After the apartment bombings in 1999 that sort of created the wave of hysteria that Vladimir Putin rode into the Kremlin, it was his channel who did a lot of work investigating whether these were in fact false flag attacks. There's this very suspicious failed bombing in Ryazan. We wouldn't know half of, if not more than that, of what we know about that had it not been for Kuczynski's NTV channel. He became very unpopular with the Kremlin as a result. His channel was expropriated. He left the country and he ended up in Israel, where he was safe. There's been many attempts to extradite him since, but he's remained safe in Israel. The same happened with Yonit and Jonathan. Again, I don't think we'd argue that he's pure as the driven snow, but the legal process that expropriated Yukos, the oil company, which he owned a significant share of, along with Mikhail Hodorkovsky and others, when that was expropriated in this farcical legal proceedings, which began in 2003, he was able to find a haven again in Israel, from which he has used as a base to launch a legal proceeding of his own, using treaties that guarantee the rights of foreign investors, and is on the brink perhaps of a $50 billion finding against the Russian Federation in exchange for having expropriated his property. So, again, I'm not necessarily defending the way that Israel has been so receptive and of people like Abramovich and happy to take his money and so on. But this is for good and bad. Haven is a tool. You can use it to hide in from goodies and you can hide in it from baddies. And the role, if you look with a slightly longer x-axis, the role that Israel has played as a haven for wealthy Russians who have, fallen out with the Putin regime have been at least as significant as it has for wealthy Russians who have, not fallen out with the Putin regime.
Can you imagine that line of thinking being used by Israel to argue that actually it should be allowed and maybe will defy international sanctions? Do you think they could be making the case, look, we've been a haven for opponents of the regime as much as we have for enablers of the regime? Could you see Israel holding out, despite Victoria Nuland's warning about being the last haven, and actually defying those EU and US sanctions?
Yeah, I think, to be honest, they could try. I'm not sure it will wash much in Washington. I don't think Washington much cares about what happened last month or the month before. They care about what's happening right now. Of course, sort of rather lost in this discussion often is the role that Ukraine also plays as a major center of Jewish emigration to Israel, as a obviously the connections between Jewish communities in Israel and Ukraine are incredibly strong. Odessa, the most famous of all the Jewish cities of the former Soviet Union. So there are many Ukrainian oligarchs of Jewish heritage, of whom Ihor Kolomoisky is the most well known, but there are many who have also with strong connections to Israel as well. So it's it cuts both ways, to be honest. In fact, it cuts in however many directions you've got. The role of Israel as a haven for Jewish people is obviously something which people from outside in the rest of the world have positive and negative feelings about, and they're only just more accentuated at the moment because of the horror of what's happening in Ukraine.
I assume, by the way, that what's happening now is a quiet freezing of assets. And definitely there are no big transactions going on between oligarchs' money into Israel. I mean, let's say I assume this plus. But by the way, you're talking, Oliver, a lot about the good and the bad. And it's really interesting because we brought this letter a few weeks ago of different organizations in Israel, Yad Vashem being one of them, that Roman Abramovich gave or was supposed to give a very big donation to, another huge hospital, the biggest hospital in Israel, writing the American ambassador here in Israel, saying, Roman Abramovich is a philanthropist, he's an Israeli citizen. We're very concerned because we're hearing that you might be considering sanctions. So how much of this is, let's say, of these oligarchs, how much of what they're doing, the good that they're doing, or is it really intentional good?
It's a really interesting question, and obviously a question that we have to confront in the UK as well, because many of the oligarchs they're not just given money to real estate agents and football clubs. They've also put money into museums and art galleries and so on. And I'm not sure that there's any way of really analysing to what extent these people are giving this money out of the kindness of their hearts, or merely because they wish to establish a reputation as a philanthropist, to make them sort of legally untouchable or politically untouchable in their countries that they've moved into. But I think we can, if you look at the objective result of what this money means, it does give the oligarchs a protection elsewhere that they don't have in other countries. There have been, it's actually quite interesting how many oligarchs have sought extra citizenships, not just Israeli citizenship. The Finnish citizenship. I think the Rosenbergs had Finnish citizenship. Mr. Abramovich himself recently gained Portuguese citizenship under a Sephardi right of return law. Obviously, many of them have British citizenship or French or so on. So, they do like to hedge their bets. And one of the really key ways of hedging your bets is to make a lot of friends. And let's face it, if you're rich, the best way to make a lot of friends is to give a bit of money around. It sounds like a lot of money to ordinary mortals, but for these people, it's a pretty cheap insurance policy. Particularly, as you say, that Israel has this very generous tax treatment for income that rises outside the country.
This is slightly at a small tangent, but I have to ask you about it because you know Russia so well, and you know Vladimir Putin's mind, I think, quite well. This speech he's given just in the last day or so, in which he talks about a fifth column and a necessary process of self-purification may be healthy for Russia. Quite a few Jewish commentators thought, oh dear, we know what that means when you start talking about fifth columns and purifying the Russian nation. That could be paranoid. Putin certainly didn't mention anything about Jews in there. I just wonder what your ear hears when you hear Vladimir Putin talking about purifying and a fifth column of traitors.
Yeah, I think we need to be careful about assuming there's too much rational thought behind some of Mr. Putin's utterances. Accusing the Jewish president of Ukraine of being a Nazi is unusual and bonkers.
It's a reach.
It's a reach, but it's bonkers, but it's not out of character. He does have a habit of throwing these things around. To my mind, one thing that one speech that speech really reminded me of was one he made in 2000, actually, when he'd only been president for, if I remember rightly, 4 or 5 months after the submarine the Kursk sank. A real disaster, one of the great flagships of the Russian Navy. It's huge incompetence in the rescue operation. Putin's response was fumbled from a PR perspective, and an actual perspective was a disaster. He lashed out at the oligarchs in exactly the same way, with very similar language, talking about people whose heart was elsewhere, who were serving foreign interests. And yes, again, those oligarchs we were talking about, Boris Berezovsky and Vladimir Gusinsky, the media barons, both of whom were Jewish. There is always, if you look for it, an overtone of that kind of nastiness. And that is deeply baked into, Russian political rhetoric for, certainly decades and possibly centuries. So, no, I don't think it's paranoia to hear that, that dog whistle hiding. It's not even a dog whistle, right? It's just a whistle. Particularly words like national traitor, which are, translated from German, right? These are not, this is very alarming. And if I were a Russian in Russia or of any ethnicity in Russia hearing that, I would be extremely concerned, because that goes in a very dark place indeed. And, I would like to think that, like in the year 2000. This is just him, lashing out and throwing out, these crazy epithets. But considering how irrationally he's behaving at the moment, considering the fact that, I mean, you say I know Putin's mind. He always surprises me on the downside, right? I didn't think he would invade Ukraine. Really, it really didn't think he would. I didn't think he'd annex Crimea, even after the troops had gone in there. I didn't think he'd invade Georgia. Things like, the poisoning of Sergei Skripal in the UK, or the assassination of Hagashvili in Berlin, is insanely reckless acts, which just seem extraordinary to me. So, I'd like to say that I wouldn't expect Putin to do anything, worse than he's already done. But I always expect that, and I'm always wrong.
Oliver Bullough, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. The book is called Butler to the World. And Oliver, really good to have you on.
Thank you very much for inviting me on. It's been my pleasure.
And ours. Thank you so much, Oliver. That was a very interesting conversation. The way that he, first of all, it's always interesting when things are not exactly black and white. They're a little bit of gray. And for example, the Leonid Nevzlins of the world, and the fact that he owns part of Haaretz newspaper, and what he was talking about used to be a Putin supporter, turned against him together with Khodorkovsky. So this is a complicated world, this world of Russian oligarchs and the Russian community in this country at large.
And I think just really interesting to hear that kind of nuance from someone who is, outside Israel. He's not like the people who wrote that letter about Roman Abramovich, who have a reason to sort of say, look, not everything here is bad. He's somebody who's been really holding the British government's feet to the fire over these oligarchs. And yet he's saying, look, there are these nuances. Some of these people are dissenting figures, and some of them are funding kind of good, even critical journalism and other work. So yeah, that was, to my mind, really interesting. He began by reminding us about the Soviet Jewish immigration to Israel.
Yeah.
And of course, it's very easy for sort of people like us to just take that as read. It does prompt a question which has been in the back of my mind, actually. I've been meaning to ask you this, which is those people who are Russian Israelis, either born in the old Soviet Union or born in Russia or Ukraine, or who have that heritage, they're the children of Russian or Soviet Jews. Where are they on this? I mean, in terms of their, I know we've talked before, I think, about their media diet is often sort of Russian language media, often even actually Russian media. Is that group of people pro-Putin, anti-Putin? Is there the full range of opinions? What are those Israelis saying?
I think that's a really interesting question. And the answer to it might surprise you. They are, for the most part, really anti-Putin, like very pro-Ukrainian, which is really interesting. The two main media outlets that the Russian-Israeli community have in this country is the newspaper called Vesti. It also has an internet site and a television channel, Channel 9. They were both blocked in Russia this week because they are so sort of leaning towards Ukraine and anti-Putin. I talked to a few, let's say, very senior representatives of that community. What they say is, look, we left when Yeltsin was in power, right? That's where the vast majority of Russian immigrants to Israel came. This was a very different Russia then. And to them, Putin is really someone who's taking Russia in off the rails to a very different direction. The interesting thing is some of them have children here, again, like their parents, sort of anti-Putin, very pro-Ukraine. Children who live there are something completely different. So, as always, kind of different shades.
It's fascinating because I just was reading something about Russians in Australia who were having some huge pro-Putin demonstration. And the writer of the piece said, diaspora communities tend to be some of the most vocal pro-Putin, ultra-nationalist Russians. Mm-hmm. And how interesting, and in some ways makes very good sense, very natural, that where the exception to that rule might be in Israel.
So we're still on the topic of Russia, Ukraine, but I want to talk a little bit, Jonathan, about what has become really a heated debate in this country the past couple of weeks, and that is the issue of acceptance of refugees. Obviously, also a topic in the UK, and it started when let's talk about the policy of the Minister of Interior, Ayelet Shaked, a policy, by the way, who has received almost no backing from her most important political partner, which is also coincidentally the Prime Minister of this country, Naftali Bennett. Now, what she said basically is saying this: I will accept any Jew under the law of return, right? Because anyone who has a Jewish grandparent can become an Israeli citizen. It's not just coming in as an immigrant. It's coming in as and becoming a citizen automatically. But anyone else we can allow in 5,000 people. Now that created a huge outrage in this country. A lot of people, including Avigdor Lieberman, who you wouldn't say is the, how shall we say, a symbol of civil liberties and et cetera, said, just let everyone in. Like anyone who wants to come in will come in and we'll sort this out later. And Shaked's supporters are saying, look, this is a Jewish state. We should first and foremost take care of our own. Now, I have to say, this really kind of speaks to the core of this country's question, right? I mean, what does it mean when you say this is a Jewish state? Does it mean you have to bring in as many Jews as possible? Or does it mean that you have Jewish values and thus will open up your borders to anyone who needs it? Because you remember quite viscerally what happened when you were standing at the borders of the world and they were closed. And I think that because of that goes to the heart of the very question of our really existence, not to be too dramatic. It has become such a heated debate.
It's such a profound question because Israel's so unusual in the world because it's a country created for a purpose. I mean, Britain just exists. It's people say, make these funny questions of when was it founded, and it's a joke if you say that because it just sort of emerged out of the mist. Israel is so different because it exists for a purpose. And it goes to this, I think, exactly the profound question you said, which is, I think for a long time Israel has believed that it discharges its moral duties to the world when it brings in Jews. That's fulfilling its purpose, to be a refuge and haven for Jews. But there is this other view, which, as you said, is that it actually has to have a kind of moral purpose beyond that, to be a kind of light unto the nations and a morally exemplary state. I think in a way it comes down to an even bigger issue, which is one for the whole Jewish world, which is, what do we mean when we say never again? Do we mean never again must Jews be persecuted in Nazi Germany by a strutting dictator in jackboots? Or do we mean never again must anything like this happen anywhere? Mm. And if it does, the answer to that question is completely different. Yeah. And because Israel is where the kind of Jewish existential drama is played out, of course it's Israel where this question becomes practical and takes material form in the form of an interior minister who has to decide. But as I say, I think there's a kind of bigger meta-philosophical question that is one for Jews everywhere. What do we mean when we say never again? What do we mean when we talk about Jewish values? Yeah. Or even the Jewish state? Is it Jewish in its character, or is it just happens to be a lot of Jewish people in there? When we say never again, do we mean never again to us? Because right. Israel takes care of that, right? But is that what we mean? Like, isn't there something more to that? And I have to tell you that the Eretz Nehederet, which is I mention them a lot. They're our Saturday Night Live, and they're really wonderful. They had this skit that got a lot of attention this week, and they had the Interior Minister, Ayelet Shaked, in the sort of standing at the border and saying, you can enter, you can't, and then turning her into actually morphing into a mandate, a British mandate officer, saying, you can't enter Palestine, go back to Europe. That was really sort of poignant. And of course, a lot of people, let's say Shaked supporters, didn't like it that much. But it does beg the question, how do we react? By the way, the policy changed, right? Now, because of this criticism, public outcry, Israel is letting in people who have any family connection in Israel, even if they are not Jewish in any way, and then saying the rest will let in 5,000. I don't assume it will get to 5,000, by the way. But essentially, the policy changed because of this outcry from the public and from the government. That is what happened this week. I'm very glad you mentioned that skit on TV because it goes to something quite interesting about how things are remembered. Mm-hmm. Britain is associated in the Israeli memory and imagination with saying no to Jews in peril, to slamming the door in the face of Jewish refugees who needed safe harbour. In Britain, the self-image has no connection to the story you've just told, and it is, if anything, the opposite. And it's invoked all the time by people, particularly who are very keen to open the doors to Ukrainian refugees. They say, Britain has a noble tradition of looking after refugees. Think of the kinder transport, the 9,000 or so Jewish children from Germany mainly, also Czechoslovakia and Austria, who came in to Britain around the time of Kristallnacht, 1938, 1939. I mean, I heard it said again this week, and it sort of, it's an exaggeration to say it made me snap, but anyway, it pushed me onto Twitter and to do a little thread where I said, look, of course, for those 9,000 Jewish children and their descendants, they will be forever grateful for the Kindertransport program that saw them come into this country. But can we remind ourselves why it's called the Kindertransport? Why was it only for children? It wasn't because the threat was only for children, against children. It was because Britain refused to let in adults. It slammed the door in the parents' face. And the policy decision was, we don't want Jews here, really. It's going to drive up anti-Semitism, which is a funny way of saying it. And therefore, Jewish groups and their allies, Quakers and others, got together and thought, well, how can we come up with a proposal that will somehow be palatable to British public opinion? I know, children. So if we say it's children, people can't refuse that. Sure enough, politicians in Britain allowed that to happen, but the result was those heartbreaking scenes of children and families being torn apart, parents handing over their children. I mention all that because all of this is about memory and history and myth and the kind of stories we tell ourselves. And in this case, there is Israel, where it sees Britain as the immigration official saying no, and Britain sees itself as the immigration official saying, yes, welcome to all these children in need. It's all, and same set of facts, but understood completely differently depending which country you're in. We have some awards to hand out, and we're going to start with the Mensch nomination, hotly fought, I have to say, this week, because a very bold bid by our Russian journalistic colleagues, the Russian television news presenter or reporter who turned protester, holding up a sign saying in English, no war, and then in Russian, they're telling you lies, and was forced into several days where she was missing. Her lawyers couldn't reach her. Apparently there's reports on the BBC that a whole lot of other Russian journalists in state TV have been resigning on principle as well. These are heroic things to do in a society like Russia. And I think, in normal times, I think that would be a slam dunk win for Mensch of the Week for showing that kind of courage and bravery. But I think they are pipped at the post by Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, a British Iranian who has been in detention, held hostage really in Iran for 6-7 years, has finally been released and touched down on British soil in the small hours of Thursday morning, along with a fellow British citizen, Anousheh Ashuri, bringing to an end really what has been a painful, painful saga. But alongside the two freed citizens after, a 6-year ordeal, really the family of Nazanin and her husband, Richard Ratcliffe, who's been this just tireless campaigner for her. And really, I think it's through, in part, his personal effort to keep her case in the headlines, to keep politicians focused on her. They have a young child. He's been living without her all this time. Somehow, I just think it's a very rare ray of light in what has been a really gloomy period. Mensch of the Week, Nazanin and her family, and really happy that they're back.
Yes,
together.
and had to do something related to modern day Persia on our Purim, conversation. So very good. I agree with both, and I would want to give us the Chutzpah Award nominee, which, by the way, was your idea, but I will take it upon me to talk. I agree with this completely. Our Chutzpah Award goes to someone who did the impossible. He united Jewish organizations all together in condemning remarks, which were at best not very well thought out, at worst, I would say, patronizing and maybe even worse. We're talking about Paul O'Brien, the U.S. director of Amnesty International, who told an audience that he did not believe that the majority of U.S. Jews were pro-Israel and attached or very attached to the Jewish state. Instead, he said Jews wanted a place that would be, quote, a safe Jewish space which would adhere to core Jewish values. Now, his basis for making this, shall I call it absurd statement, was not anything empirical. He just said that it's comments were based on something his gut told him. I'll just sort of emphasize this again for a moment, Jonathan. He said that the Jews shouldn't have a statehood, but instead a safe place and become a protected minority, because that works very well in the Middle East, and that works pretty well for Jews during history. So again, he's wrong, and that's fine, and you know, that's okay to be wrong. I just say that to say that the majority of American Jews agree with that because his guts tell him so, his arrogance, and I think a bit more than chutzpah. He then later said he was misreported. The Jewish Insider, which first reported this, published a transcript showing that indeed he had said exactly what they reported him to say. Just general rule, I think, in life. If you're in a hole which you dug, just stop digging. That's what I had to say.
Yeah, no, I think a good choice. Again, I agree with you. I think it's not really the substance. Those are legitimate views. You have, people like Peter Beinart saying similar things, but it is a chutzpah to say that you, somebody who's not Jewish, knows what Jews really feel based on your gut. That's never going to work out well. You have to let people speak for themselves rather than hoping your innards will do the talking for them. So I think that is our award winner for this week. And we have awards, all our award winners duly sealed. I think we want to tell people, if you are listening to this and enjoying it, we would love it if you obviously become a regular subscriber, but also do give us a review or a rating. That really helps bring other people to the podcast. And we have some people to thank.
We do, and we're going to thank Rom Atik, Lior Friedman, Omer Primat, and Irad Eshel for original music. I, Jonathan, have to get ready for a Purim party tonight. I'm going as an uptight and over-serious news anchor woman. It's a costume I know very well. And we will see each other next week.
We will. I'm not going to say anything about that because I think that's too harsh. I think if you go in that kind of fancy dress costume, people will hardly recognize you. They'll say, "Where is Yonit Levy?" Good to be with you this time. Let's see each other next week.
We will.